They laughed at my rusty car. Not a polite chuckle tossed over a canapé or a quiet private joke behind closed doors. Full-throated, camera phone-lifted laughter that rolled across the reunion parking lot like a single cruel wave. The hood of my car sighed when I shut it. A thin line of rust traced the edge of the driver's door, a place where rain and time had stubbornly agreed to leave marks. Someone snapped a photo. Someone else sent a voice note that I could hear in the air. Is that hers? A man I hadn't spoken to since sophomore year, clapping like a judge, said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "They say ambition ages you. Guess someone forgot to buy their moisturizer." I remember the metal smell of my car, the nicotine of old upholstery, the way the steering wheel warmed in my hands. I remember the sudden, bright sting of shame, not because my life was messy, but because I had the misfortune of my mess being visible at the very moment the world expected me to perform as somebody else's idea of a success. Shame is a peculiar thing. It surfaces in seconds and then insists on staying longer than the laughter. My name is Madison Hayes. I was 28 when I moved to the city with a duffel and a head full of spreadsheets, and 39 the night the reunion organizers thought it would be funny to make me the evening spectacle. Between those numbers, there are 10 years that no one attending that lot would have guessed at a glance. A decade of missed weekends, of investing my vacations into runway meetings and product sprints. A decade of saying I can't more than I will to family dinners and small-town rituals. I don't say this to boast. I say it because context matters, because the rusty car did not tell the whole story, and neither did the laughter. People pretend that humility and poverty are interchangeable, that if your car has seen better days, your worth must have been misallocated somewhere between the muffler and the gas tank. They like simple narratives. Small car equals small life. So they laughed. They loved the easy story. I didn't argue that night. I didn't shout or show my investments. I let the laughter wash over me, and I let the air clear with the calmness of someone who has rehearsed not answering out of anger 1,000 times. On the drive home, I sat in my car and counted the constellations of dents on the dashboard like a ritual. The radio hummed. A late-night infomercial promised overnight riches in a voice that sounded exactly like all the voices that wanted me to be smaller. I turned it off. If you're hearing this and thinking it's a petty small-town anecdote, hold that thought. I want you to feel the texture of that parking lot, the gravel under the tires, the echo of heels on asphalt, the way a single smartphone can hold 1,000 witnesses. Because what happened there wasn't just a joke. It was a test. And I'd spent a decade learning how to answer tests without breaking my rules. There are two versions of me in most people's heads. One is the girl with the rust spots and the resigned smile. The other is the woman people assume I must be to drive anything else. Flashy, thirsty for approval, showy about success. Both are caricatures. The truth is a longer story that starts with a small apartment and a second-hand laptop and a refusal to take no for an answer. I grew up in a place where the gossip was keener than summer storms. My parents loved me in the blunt, practical way small-town folks do. Soccer trophies on the mantle, a brand new toaster for prom, advice measured in savings plans, and quiet warnings. They were not unkind, but they were conservative in ways that taught me two lessons. 1, stability is desirable, and 2, loudly chasing more would unsettle the delicate balance they'd built. They wanted me safe. For a long time, I listened. Then a recruiter called me about an internship in a city 2 states away, and I counted the coins in my drawer and realized safety comes in many sizes, and not everyone had to be approved by the family meeting. I moved. I swallowed loneliness. I worked nights that blunted the rest of the world, and days that rubbed raw against my early ambition. I slept on an air mattress under a window that leaked rain, and gained one small, stubborn confidence. I could make value where others saw only risk. I learned to code, to read balance sheets, to translate the opaque language of investor decks into a product roadmap. I learned how to tell a story about a problem that people agreed to pay to solve. I learned that deals are not magic. They're patiently applied pressure, one meeting at a time. There were private victories. The first time a client called to say they'd signed, I cried in the stairwell of our office because I hadn't realized how much of me I'd given to that contract. I remember the day our valuation doubled after a strategic partnership with a much older firm. The champagne that night didn't feel like celebration so much as validation, a permission slip to keep doing what I'd decided to do when no one was watching. I also remember the price: canceled birthdays, silent apologies to friends who'd stop answering my texts, a relationship that frayed because love wasn't enough to bridge a CV and constant travel. People who live in small towns like mine like to summarize the years into neat lessons. She always liked numbers more than people. She never wanted kids. She got cold. These are bullet points on a rumor sheet. They are not the months of insomnia before a pitch, the dozens of lunches I scheduled with people who didn't return my calls, or the nights when a mentor said simply, "Keep your head down, build the work, and someday it will speak for you." That last line, "someday it will speak for you," became a religion to me. I built in silence because I had been burned by applause that walked away when the curtains were closed. If you're reading this and wondering whether I had a strategy for money, yes, of course I did. But strategy isn't only about spreadsheets and stock options. It's also about relationships, perceptions, and guarding the one thing no one can buy: your reputation. You protect it by being indispensable, not by being loud. You protect it by choosing the right allies, the people who can put their weight behind your name when an audience of strangers decides to be cruel. That brings me to Marcus. Marcus Chen is not an angel is better than product biography. He is a very practical man with a tidy beard and an even tidier Rolodex. He is the person most of us in the industry call a mentor because that's shorter than naming someone who once put $1 million behind a half-formed plan and then sat back to see if we could make good on it. He didn't invest because he liked me. He invested because he could see a defensible product and, crucially, because I'd built the kind of team that could do the hard work after the announcement. Marcus became my ally the way water becomes a river through patient persistence. Gradually. Inevitably. When people ask me now whether Marcus saved me that night, I correct them. Marcus didn't save me. The company I held, call it Solace Systems, had been profitable for 3 consecutive years. There were tens of thousands of users who valued our product, contract renewals that read like small victories, and a board that respected our metrics. Marcus had invested early, yes, but he also knew the terrain. His involvement mattered less as an act of charity and more as leverage when a social problem threatened a shareholder problem. At the reunion, leverage is not a word people use. They think leverage sounds corporate, impersonal, something that belongs in quarterly reports. But leverage is simply the power to make a decision carry consequence. When a board member can suggest a client pull a contract, when a major investor can hint at reviewing leadership, that is leverage. It is not about vengeance. It is about the language institutions respond to: risk, fallout, and exposure. The night of the reunion, after the laughter and the nicknames and the people filming me like I was a trivia answer, I did what I always do when the world insists I'm a smaller story than I am. I did not perform for them. I did not explain. I drove home and called someone who understands how institutions breathe. That was the practical choice. The emotional choice was harder. I had been dismissed my whole life with a variety of polite phrases. You're intense. You're hard to get to know. You always work too much. The reunion's jibes stitched themselves into the long line of small cuts. But I'd learned to measure how much of me to spend on immediate sharpness. What I kept for myself, I deployed later like a reserve. Before I go further, here's a small favor. If this story connects to something you've felt, if you've ever been underestimated because your shoes were a little scuffed, or because you chose a career that made you miss Sunday dinners, pause for a second and like this video. Subscribe if you value stories of people who choose strategy over spectacle. I'm not asking for applause. I'm asking for witnesses who want to keep learning how to carry themselves through the small cruelties of life. After I hung up with Marcus that night, things moved fast. Not the dramatic fast of movies, where a phone rings and a montage begins. Fast in the corporate way, measured, considered, and punctuated by a string of small, consequential choices. I called my legal counsel, who does not do heroics, but knows how to translate risk into language that boards and investors read with interest. I wrote a short note to the team. Handling a personal situation. I will be offline for most of the evening. Please hold any external communications. My assistant replied with a stream of logistics. Who had to be called, which media accounts were active, a summary of trending tags. The viral mechanics are mundane. A live video, a dozen shares, a celebrity account retweeting with a snarky comment. Those are the levers the internet uses. We watch that machinery with the same clinical detachment we bring to financial models. I want to pause here and talk about humiliation, because we'll need to come back to it. Humiliation is weird. It feels like being exposed to oxygen when your instinct wants to hold your breath. It makes your body do small things. Your palms become wet. Your jaw tightens. Your voice feels like a borrowed thing. But humiliation is also a social currency. When you are humiliated publicly, the people watching get a dopamine hit. They feel superior. They feel connected to each other for a moment. But social currency is ephemeral. The money that actually matters, the kind that pays rent, funds research, supports payroll, listens to different sounds, contracts, board minutes, investor confidence. My plan, if you want to call it that, was to let the currency that hurt me pass through its moment of being sharp and then settle into the kind of consequence that institutions respect. We didn't move on the first night. Marcus suggested, in his calm way, that attention could be moved. "Madison," he said, "they think it's a joke. Let's turn it into a conversation they can't ignore." That was his way of asking me if I wanted the response to be reputational, corporate, or purely personal. I chose a path that was cleaner and sharper than immediate shaming. We used transparency and consequence. Not because I wanted salvation from the past, but because I wanted the future to make different choices obvious to people who built reputations on being cruel. Here's the thing about leverage. It needs to be credible. Marcus has a network. He has clients who pay attention to his portfolio and boards that listen. He had, over the years, made sure to be near institutions that would act if something affected their risk profile. We didn't call for revenge. We articulated risk. A major client of a company on our board would be expected to care if their name appeared in a trending hashtag tied to harassment or bad PR. That is not a moral story. That's a feature of business ethics in the social media era. Companies move to avoid reputational damage. Boards move to avoid risk. Investors move to protect their positions. We used that mechanism, not because we were ruthless, but because it was practical and effective. Between the call with Marcus and the next morning, I slept and didn't sleep. I thought about the parking lot, about the way people had smiled at my supposed misfortune and then taken a photo as if they were capturing history. In the morning, I sat at my kitchen table and opened a small, ordinary notebook where I keep plain lists. What to say, what not to say, who to notify, who to protect. I wrote dignity first at the top in block letters, because if you don't decide to hold your dignity, the world will try to define it for you. We pulled together a simple statement. No melodrama, no accusations, just facts. That the event had occurred, that it had been recorded and shared, that the company was aware and monitoring reputational impact where appropriate. Marcus arranged a private conversation with 2 members of the board and suggested a discreet internal review of any client connections that might be sensitive. The legal team issued a gentle reminder about codes of conduct. It sounds small, but the combination of an investor's concern, a board's attention, and a legal note is like a pressure wave in a quiet room. People begin to reposition. Clients check their risk dashboards. PR teams draft contingency statements. The social media side was relentless. The video that started as a recording on a single phone spread the way a dropped stone makes rings. There were the expected reactions, sympathy posts, mocking montages, memes built on ancient cruelties. There were also the curious things. A thread from a former teacher remembering me as a kid who stayed extra hours to help classmates with algebra. A dog-eared yearbook snippet that didn't match the image the reunion crowd had printed in their heads. The internet, for all its cruelty, also contains pockets of context. Someone posted a link to an old blog where I had quietly chronicled product milestones long before Solace had a name. People dug up the small traces I'd left behind when I wasn't performing for an audience. Those traces were inconveniently human. Then there were the messages from people I hadn't known I had on my side. Colleagues who'd been through toxic leadership before, women who'd been shamed at public events, clients who sent private notes about how they respected our product. Those notes of solidarity mattered. They didn't erase the sting, but they countered the story that my worth was measured by dented chrome. That first week was a strategic mosaic. We did not march into the reunion hall like vendettas in heels. We did not demand apologies from people who would only perform contrition. We moved pieces on a board, protect the brand, warn the board, engage selectively in public statements, and prepare for the possibility that the reunion organizers would try to amplify their version of events. At the same time, there was a quieter operation I ran for myself. I changed a few passwords, cut off some channels. For years, I had tolerated small invasions in the name of staying connected, accepting passive-aggressive emails, being polite to people who enjoyed small cruelties. I closed those doors. It was not dramatic. It was a series of clicks and a reallocation of my energy. Boundaries are boring paperwork most of the time, but they are fortress work when circumstances demand it. 2 days after the reunion, I sat with my lawyer and my PR lead in a small conference room with glass walls that revealed the sliver of skyline people buy when they think success must look a certain way. I remember thinking, with the detached amusement of someone watching a weather report, that our lives had become an exercise in optics and contracts. We filed a factual note with the reunion organizers. We informed certain clients of potential reputational exposure. We monitored the social conversation for anything that could harm the company. The goal was not to destroy anyone. The goal was to make it clear that small cruelties born in a parking lot could have ripple effects in contracts and reputations where people tend to pay attention. Some of the reunion crowd tried to apologize online, short posts, awkwardly phrased. Others doubled down. A former class president made a video that began polite and then found its way into 1,000 critiques for making the night about tradition and fun. An influencer posted a clip with a caption making the reunion the punchline of the week. It all felt surreal because the cruelty was banal and the consequences real. I want to be obvious about something. Wielding leverage means you're entering a system that responds to institutionally framed risks. There are people for whom the language of risk is opaque. Those people will think you used money or influence to win in a way that feels unfair. They don't see the years of late nights that paid for the leverage. They don't see the contracts that hung in the balance. They don't see the team who depended on steady revenues to keep doing their work. My strategy was not to humiliate for pleasure. It was to use the tools I had to protect a company and a team. It's a bitter truth in modern life that sometimes dignity needs institutional muscle. That doesn't make it any cleaner. It simply makes it effective. One afternoon, as the social storm orbited and the news feeds churned, Marcus came by the office. He walked in with the sort of casual authority that makes people straighten without thinking about it. We went to his office. He closed the door. He didn't offer a speech. He offered options. He mapped out what influence could do. Prompt a board conversation, encourage major clients to publicly distance from the organizers if they had not already, and quietly discuss reputational risk with partners who had sway. He also reminded me of something I already knew and still sometimes needed to hear. Your worth is not a public referendum. There's a path that doesn't require you to spell out your whole life on a stage, he said. We can make the next chapter visible without making it cruel. That sentence, make the next chapter visible, was the hinge. I could walk back into that room and let the rumor define me again and again, or I could step through the same door on new terms. What followed was months of work that had nothing glamorous about it. Negotiations with partners and clients, a few strategic hires to shore up leadership, quiet conversations with investors. We prepared for an audit of our public presence. We made sure contracts were airtight in ways that matter when reputation is at stake. We didn't talk about numbers publicly. We simply ensured the company could weather storms, and that our leadership had the support of stakeholders who were responsible for enterprise stability. Meanwhile, there were personal choices, smaller and thornier. My parents reached out in ways that tried not to prickle. My father, practical to the core, called me and asked if I had been handled properly. He didn't mean malice. He meant, do you have what you need to survive this? I told him the truth. That I did. Because of years of work, and because I had allies, and because I refused to let the world define my dignity. He listened, and I could hear something like relief, complicated with a quiet pride that didn't know how to be said. Among the people who had laughed in the parking lot, reactions differed. Some tried to make themselves small after seeing the ripple of consequences. Some never acknowledged anything. A small few attempted to turn the narrative into a performance piece of foolishness they could repent from later. Public life, I've learned, is a gallery of performances. What matters is not the first act. It's what you choose to do when the audience is distracted and the cameras are off. I won't pretend the process didn't bruise me. There were nights I lay awake cataloging the way words had landed. There were mornings I walked briskly to the subway and pretended the noise was a drumbeat for something better. I learned to let myself feel it. Anger, hurt, embarrassment, then file those feelings where feelings live, not in the decision-making folders. I used them to sharpen my intent, not to blunt someone else. At the heart of all this, beneath the corporate moves and the PR meetings, was a simpler human project, choosing who I would let stay in my life. For years, I'd tolerated small cruelties because I wanted to be liked, because I thought the safety of social approval might repay my discomfort. I stopped doing that. I made easy decisions. People who enjoyed humiliating others were not allowed near my work. People who rewarded cruelty with laughter were not invited to my future. Banishment is a dramatic term. In our story, exclusion was more like curating a garden, removing the plants that poison the soil. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the reunion incident, a journalist called. She asked the standard questions with a tone meant to probe for scandal. I gave her the truth, that what happened was painful, that our company took potential reputational exposure seriously, and that I was focused on the work that sustained hundreds of people. She asked if I intended to return to the next alumni event. I paused. That pause made an editor's headline or a commentator's tweet, depending on the angle they wanted. I decided then that if I went back, it would be on my terms. Which brings us back to the parking lot and the rusty car and the people who thought a dented hood was a story. Plans were made. One of the hardest things about the strategy we designed was that it required patience. The internet demands immediate answers. Institutions demand data, calm, and consequence. I had to inhabit both timelines at once, the hot, furious now that wanted to be loud, and the slow, steady now that builds defenses and cultivates irreversible change. The day I decided to return to the reunion, it wasn't because I wanted to gloat. It was because there was an opportunity to close a loop in a way that didn't make me less of myself. I wanted to stand in a room where I had once been small and be the same person, calm, competent, unshaken, so that other people might see how dignity looked when it was reclaimed. I wanted to choose generosity over spectacle. I wanted to make it clear that people who laughed didn't get to define the future without consequence. In the week leading up to my return, the world began to tilt in subtle ways. People who had been performatively indifferent found themselves apologizing in awkward emails. A few organizers got defensive and then defensive in a new way when partners started asking questions. The social feeds continued to spin, but the energy shifted. Some of the laughter was replaced by curiosity. How? Why? Who is she really? We orchestrated nothing flashy. What we did was make sure that when I returned, I did so with a plan that protected my dignity and my team's security. Marcus and I agreed on a few public moments that were true. Short statements, gestures of calm, a refusal to be baited. We would not use wealth as a weapon. We would use it as a shield, as evidence that choices could be made. Part of me wanted to be subtle because subtlety removes the temptation for people to moralize over your motives. If your return is loud, the story becomes about your loudness, not the lesson. The night before, there was an odd, quiet tenderness to the preparation. I packed 2 outfits. One was deliberately understated, a way to walk in that said, "I am present, not performative." The other was a dress that felt like a private poem, crafted, elegant, something that made me feel like myself without announcing to the world I had arrived. I practiced nothing. I let the preparation be practical. Pieces organized, notes in my bag for anyone who wanted to talk business, and a small list of people I intended to find and talk to privately. My assistant texted, an image of the reunion schedule, a note about a microphone, and underneath it, a single line. "There will be cameras." I replied with 2 words. "Then there will be witnesses." On the morning I left, I parked my old car in the same lot I had the first night. I sat in it, fingers on the steering wheel, and for a moment allowed the memory of laughter to land and settle. It did not consume me. It was one of many things that had shaped the line I would walk across the room. I closed the car door and picked up my phone. Then the call came. Marcus's name flashed on the screen. His voice was flatly amused as if he were calling from a control room in a play. "Everything's in place," he said. "We've had 3 major partners confirm they'll be there. The board is ready to back any necessary steps. More importantly, you have options, public and private. What do you want to make visible tonight?" I told him with a voice even and calm that I wanted to make my dignity visible. That I did not want to be the story of humiliation and comeback so much as the story of someone who refused to be owned by a narrative other people wrote for her. He answered with a clarity I appreciated. Then do that. Walk in as you are, not to prove them wrong, but to show them what you already know. We'll handle the rest. The car waiting for me at the curb, clean, dark glass, no logos, looked like an empty promise. For a moment I thought of the old hood, the dent that had become the source of 1,000 jokes. Then I thought about the long work that sat behind both dents and polished doors. Leverage isn't flash, it's quiet. It is the network of people who will insist the institutions that matter behave responsibly. It is the decision to use power to protect rather than punish. I slid into the back seat. The driver started the engine. The city moved past the window in long ribbons of late light. My phone vibrated. Messages of support. A brief note from a former colleague who had once wished they'd had my courage. A text from my mother that simply read, "Be you." The ride was short. The heart pulse was long. As we approached the venue, the world smelled like late summer. Grass, a hint of exhaust, and the building's exterior glittered in a way that felt designed for theatrics. I watched flats of faces through the glass. Classmates who had once traced my name in yearbooks, organizers busy in a way that suggested they were curating a narrative. Cameras were already set up on tripods. The red glow of a live indicator pulsed in a corner of the courtyard like a distant warning light. The driver pulled the car to the valet. The door opened. For the first time in a long while, I felt the small, simple luxury of being allowed to take up as much space as I needed. I stepped out. The air met me like a hand I'd been waiting to shake. The flash of cameras blossomed. People I hadn't spoken to in years looked at me the way people look at a sudden weather change, checking the sky, calculating what it means. I didn't step forward. I let the moment hover. I breathed. I could feel the buffet of expectations. Expectation to taunt, expectation to be humbled, expectation to perform. And then I turned toward the entrance with the ease of someone who had rehearsed nothing and yet had rehearsed all along. At the threshold, someone shouted a question meant sharper than a greeting. There was a rustle of laughter. I paused. The driver closed the door behind me. Marcus's text lit my phone. 3 words that felt less like instruction and more like permission. Now, quietly. I stepped into the building with the kind of calm that comes from a long practice of being underestimated. The foyer smelled of lemon and polished wood. Voices rose and fell like a tide. I felt the low hum of attention, curiosity, the kind that had once been amusement, now mixed with something like recalibration. And then, as I made the short walk into the room where my classmates and the world waited with their phones up, the air shifted. A dozen devices pointed my way. A camera cut to live. The red live dot blinked wider. I paused at the top of the first step. The narrative I'd been carrying, years of work, quiet victories, alliances like Marcus, choices to protect my dignity, did not reveal itself in a single glance. But I knew something the parking lot laughter could not change. My worth is not a function of which car I own. A man near the entrance, a familiar smirk paused mid-chew, raised his phone as if to capture a punchline. The room leaned in. A host cleared her throat and tried to make the evening resume normalcy. I let the silence lay itself across the room like a sheet. People were waiting for either spectacle or surrender. Then, just as I was about to step into the light, my phone buzzed with a single message that was both practical and intent-setting. An update from Marcus. The note contained nothing about money. It contained 3 simple words. When you're ready. I inhaled. The night was full of choices. Behind every choice was a consequence I had already thought through. I had not come to the reunion to punish anyone. I had come because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is show up being fully yourself. The second the doors opened and the crowd's attention folded toward me, my hand slipped into my bag for a small card, an unremarkable thing printed with a message I wanted to speak privately to certain people. I had 2 lists, people to speak with behind closed doors and people to leave in the past. The card sat cool against my fingers like an anchor. Outside, in the parking lot, the old car's dent glinted under a street lamp, its rust catching the light like a map of all the nights I'd chosen work over applause. Inside, the room inhaled. I stepped forward, and for a moment everything paused. And then the host cleared her throat and said, "Madison Hayes, would you—" I didn't answer out loud. I lifted my chin and walked toward the center of the room with an ease so deliberate it felt like a secret. The next few moments would determine the shape of the evening, how much spectacle there would be, how much dignity I would keep, and whether the people who had mocked me would see the cost of their laughter in ways they hadn't anticipated. My phone buzzed again. A short, contained vibration. Another message from Marcus, a single line of confirmation. The driver outside exhaled through his nose like someone waiting to see whether a small weather change would become a storm. I put my card back into my bag. The air felt charged, not with electricity, but with attention. I stepped fully into the light. What happened next would not be decided by me alone. It would be a conversation between the room and the institutions that watched with interest. It would be a test of whether dignity could be reclaimed without becoming a spectacle of revenge. And it would be the moment where choices, mine and other people's, would start to settle into shape. I took a breath, and then the doors behind me closed. The sound of a camera shutter clicked like a metronome. The evening moved forward. The red live dot blinked, and the room inhaled like a city before rain. Phones lifted. Conversations tapered into the soft rustle of fabric and the nervous clink of glassware. For a few seconds, everything felt like the moment before an orchestra begins. Expectation without a conductor. Then someone laughed, small and brittle, as if laughter could stitch back the old story. I felt the air differently now. Not lighter, the laughter had not dissolved, but thicker, as if attention had weight. People looked at me the way they look at a painting that costs more than the house next door. Curiosity, calculation, an attempt to assign meaning without context. A woman I vaguely remembered from homeroom, still wearing the same practiced smile, tilted her head and mouthed, "Isn't she the one?" Her voice trailed. The sentence wanted completion. The one who ruined herself for work, or the one who couldn't buy a nicer car. I let it stay incomplete. My phone buzzed in my bag. Marcus had texted one word, "Now." I folded my breath around that single syllable and stepped forward. I had rehearsed nothing, but I had prepared everything. The clip I carried in my pocket was not a speech, but a few polite lines written down. Truth that would not require theater. Gratitude for the invitation. A reminder that people are more than a single frame. And a short note about dignity. I wanted my words to be short, because shortness has a way of not begging for applause. I cleared my throat because it felt like method acting to clear a throat at a reunion where people are waiting for drama. Then I spoke. "Thank you for having me," I said. My voice sounded like me, level and close. I won't take much time. I wanted to say something simple. Laughter at another person's expense costs nothing to the laugher and costs everything to the person laughed at. I don't expect anyone to understand all of the years behind my choices. You don't have to. I simply ask that we treat one another with more generosity than we did that night. A pause. Some people nodded. Some shifted, constellations of discomfort rearranging on their faces. A man in the back tried to interject with a joke, old performative territory, and the room tensed. I did not invite his sentence to finish. I let the silence hold. Then, because silence can be a weapon as well as a balm, my phone vibrated with a notification so well-timed it felt choreographed. A major partner associated with one of the event sponsors, a company whose logo was on the banner outside, had issued a statement on their official channel. It was short, corporate, almost dull. "We are aware of recent public content related to last weekend's alumni event. Our company values respectful communities and is evaluating our association with events that do not reflect those values." The comment had a link to a PR policy and an image of their brand guidelines. The statement was not accusatory. It didn't need to be. It simply introduced an institutional factor into a social dinner. A ripple moved through the room like wind over flags. The organizers' faces changed. The host's smile faltered. People who'd been smug a heartbeat before suddenly checked their phones. Cameras panned, and the red dot on a live stream grew in perceived significance. The laughter died like an engine cutting out. I could feel the math changing. Humiliation had been social currency in that parking lot. Now an institutional currency had entered the market. Contracts had, in my world, always been noise until they were headlines. A headline drew attention from people with checkbooks and decision-making power. Marcus had not asked for a headline. He had nudged an ecosystem that pays attention to risk. "That's unfortunate," the man who'd tried the joke muttered, and his voice had the smallness of someone who'd bet on cruelty and found the table moved. I kept my hands in my pockets. I did not smile too wide or look triumphant. There is a strange, corrosive pleasure in watching a room fold in on itself because the jokes have lost their echo, but I did not want to live in that pleasure. My satisfaction, such as it was, lived in the way the conversation had changed its currency, from gossip to consequence. After I spoke, a few people approached with hesitant hands. Some offered apologies that felt like clearing their throat, awkward and necessary. Others wanted to discuss what they'd seen online, as if placing the moment in a larger narrative would make them blameless. I spoke to a handful of them quietly, and not to be magnanimous so much as to be clear. "I don't need your explanation," I said once. "I need your change." It is a small request, change, not contrition performed on camera, but different habits in private. One woman I hadn't expected to find me that night stood at the edges of the cluster. Her hair was gray at the temples, and she had taught chemistry in our high school for 40 years. Her hands were marked with the faint stains of experiments. She had once stayed after class to help me with stoichiometry, because asking for help had felt easier than being left behind. She took my hand then and squeezed, saying only, "You did it." No nuance, no extra clause. That squeeze felt like a benediction. Not everyone warmed. There were people whose cruelty was habitual. It functioned as armor and amuse-bouche. A few of them left early, their departure a small retreat that said more than any apology. Later, social feeds would note their absence. Their absence would become, for some of them, a proxy for accountability. Doors closed where they had expected the floor to remain open. Backstage, after my short talk, there were other conversations. Marcus was waiting just beyond the room's exit with a calm expression that I have seen last-minute actors wear before opening nights. He did not hug me, because we don't do stage hugs in my world, but he did offer a nod, an old gesture between allies that meant, we moved the board. We nudged the partners. Now it's on them. "Good," he said. He had already briefed our PR team to keep things modest. We were not seeking arcs or headlines. We were aligning facts with behavior. He told me quietly that a few sponsor partners were considering formal distancing, and that the board had prepared a brief for any partner who wanted to understand the risks of the event association. He also said, precisely, I sent a note to 2 partners that we had options if the situation escalated. He didn't say which. He didn't need to. A journalist approached with a recorder and the profession's practiced curiosity. She wanted a soundbite, a moment of heat to feed an audience. I gave her a simple answer about dignity, about the way private choices accumulate into public consequence. I refused to make the night about my personal injuries. I wanted the story to be about choices, other people's and mine. The journalist's pen moved, and later her piece would be steady rather than sensational. I prefer small, steady articles to viral firestorms. They last. That night, long after the room had emptied into old friends' hugs and new awkwardness, the online conversation took over the story's life. Threads branched from the original clip, alumni who defended their choices, classmates who said they had never meant harm, a few who offered context about me that cut against the caricatures. And, in the quiet corners of direct messages, there were disparate notes, people offering resources, others asking if they could meet to talk about harassment in their workplaces, and a handful that offered solidarity without expectation. I slept badly that night, which is to say I slept like someone who had finally let go of the urge to be performatively okay and was now allowing the after-images to pass. The next morning, the feeds held the residue, commentary, opinion pieces, and a montage of reactions. There were op-eds about the culture of small humiliations and the way social media amplifies them. There were the inevitable think pieces on how institutions respond to brand risk. My name trended for a while, sandwiched between earnest sympathy posts and the usual snark. I drank coffee and read the pieces with the detached curiosity of someone watching a market tick. And then the calls came. Not just the supportive texts, but the practical ones. A major partner's legal counsel called our general counsel to ask if we had any comment on the event's affiliation. A board member scheduled a call, not because they were interested in spectacle, but because they were interested in enterprise stability. Those calls are humdrum in their tone, neutral, professional. They contain no dramatic language, only the tenor of institutions measuring exposure. That neutral tone is a kind of power in itself. We spent a week in a low roar of activity. Press checks, partner meetings, client reassurances. Each conversation was careful, meticulous, repeating a simple line. Our company values inclusive, respectful communities. We also made operational adjustments. Event policies tightened, social conduct addenda reissued to partners, and a small internal workshop about digital etiquette for employees. All of it felt like preventive medicine, boring, practical, and designed to reduce the risk of recurrence. Meanwhile, something else was forming that would be harder to draft into memos, a sense of belonging that came not from being accepted by the people who laughed, but from standing with people who had been laughed at before. Messages came from women who had been sidelined at corporate dinners, from folks who had been made the butt of jokes because they didn't fit early templates of success. I began receiving requests to speak. Quiet panels, closed workshops, mentoring sessions. I said yes to many of them. It felt like reallocation, using the hard-earned attention to protect others. Several months later, when the dust had settled in the way dust settles after a passing storm, some stirred up, some quietly buried, there was an invitation that changed the public shape of the story. A community foundation in my hometown wanted to start a fund for young people interested in technology who didn't have the private capital to pursue learning opportunities. They asked if I would consider supporting a scholarship and mentoring program. I remember the conversation about 40 minutes into sleep-deprived brainstorming, where the foundation's director said simply, "We want kids from here to know they can go somewhere without losing home." Giving can be performative. I know this. I've sat in boardrooms where philanthropic announcements are scripted for maximum halo. So, before we agreed, I insisted on two things. First, that the funds be directed to actual programs with measurable outcomes, scholarships, a coding lab, mentorship stipends, and second, that the program provide a mechanism to bring those students back and invest in their hometowns. My idea of generosity is not a one-way broadcast, but a circuit. People lifted who can lift others. We set the terms not to get praise, but to be sure the money did what money is supposed to do: solve a need. When the donation went public 6 months after the reunion, the headlines were short. Alumna funds tech scholarships, and, in smaller print, emphasizes local impact. I did a short interview where I said something true and deliberately unsentimental. Success can be private, I said. Philanthropy should be about building ladders, not throwing confetti. The interview did not need to be grand. It was functional, like the scholarships it described. After that, things rearranged in quieter ways. The people who'd been most gleeful in the parking lot had to confront small consequences. A few found themselves receiving fewer invitations to community boards or volunteer roles. Others had their social media channels reassessed by employers who preferred not to be associated with controversy. None of this was orchestrated to humiliate. It was the natural consequence of decisions in a world where reputations affect opportunity. I didn't call for their punishment. I simply noted where their behavior aligned poorly with institutions that valued civility. The market does the rest. A couple of years later, when the business closed an acquisition that had been in the works for 18 months, there was a moment when my net worth crossed a threshold that put my name into a new category in finance articles: Billionaire. The number is an odd thing to carry. It's a way the world measures discrete success with round figures. To me, it was a byproduct of a long accumulation of choices: product-market fit, disciplined reinvestment, a patient approach to governance, and a team that executed when I could not be everywhere. I didn't think of it as a magic spell. I thought of it as evidence that small, persistent decisions compound. Walking into the reunion that second time, the entrance that completed the arc the title of this story promises, was not about proving the financial metric. I had worn an outfit that didn't scream wealth. I wanted the reveal to be about another kind of clarity: agency. A few people gasped when they realized the company on their magazines was mine. A few phones shifted from curios to calculators. The room's temperature changed. For some, the shock was a small correction. For others, it felt like embarrassment. A handful of people who had laughed the first time reached for a handshake that felt more like a question: will you accept or decline? I accepted. I declined the urge to deliver a line that would have been cinematic in a movie but cheap in life. Wealth in my hands was not for theatrics, it was for options. So instead of a speech that would be replayed for clicks, I had a series of private conversations. To the woman who had mocked my car in the parking lot, I said, "People can change. If you're curious about where you went wrong, I'll talk with you. But not tonight." To a former classmate who'd become a local politician and who had posted a defensive video, I said in an email some weeks later, "You can do better. Public service must be humble." There were consequences not because I wielded money as a club, but because institutions and communities recalibrate when reputations shift. Contracts get reviewed, volunteer lists are updated, and event organizers become more careful about how they curate narratives. Those are, for better or worse, the levers that move culture. They are messy. They are imperfect, but they change who is invited to the table. In the months after the reunion, we formalized one small program inside our company, a funded partnership with community organizations for diversity and inclusion in tech. We gave microgrants to groups in towns like mine, set up mentorship stipends that paid young people to spend summers learning at our offices, and launched a fellowship for women who had been out of the workforce and wanted re-entry through technical training. The reasons were practical: a wider talent pipeline and a less fragile talent pool. The reasons were moral. I remembered how small-town resources had been calibrated toward survival, not excellence. Our gifts were targeted, not performative. There is a shadow side to the narrative, and I will be honest about it. The price of asserting boundaries can include loneliness. Cutting ties with people who are toxic is not an aesthetic decision. It is often a painful, necessary pruning. My parents adapted over time. My father called less often initially, perplexed by my refusal to play conciliatory games. But over time, the distance stitched into different conversations. He began to call with questions about my programs, asking about kids who'd been helped. Even practical men can find ways to be proud when the metrics align with something they understand. I also learned something about generosity as closure. It's easy to think that a big donation or a public act will cleanse a past humiliation. It doesn't. Generosity is not a cure for pain. It is, however, a mechanism by which you can redirect the energy that pain produces. Instead of letting humiliation calcify into bitterness, I aimed that energy into scaffolding for others. That didn't erase the nights I felt small. It gave those nights a use. A few of the classmates who had laughed reached out in time with genuine attempts at amends. I welcomed some with conditions: show up and do the work to be accountable, not perform repentance. A couple of people wanted quick absolution, as if an apology on social media was a final ledger entry. I resisted those. Accountability is not an Instagram story. It's sustained behavior change. Some relationships never return to their former shapes. And I don't pretend that was easy. But there is a form of relief in pruning. It frees up capacity to invest in relationships that are reciprocal. I found family in unexpected rooms, in colleagues who had been present during long nights, in mentors who had placed bets on my competence rather than my charisma, and in friends who had chosen to stay. Those people are my chosen family. They are the ones who showed up without expectation and who learned with me how to carry dignity. There are practical lessons in the hum of the whole episode. If you are building something, be it a company, a reputation, or a life, do not mistake the visible for the complete. People will judge on frames because it's easier. The long work happens in the margins. The early morning emails, the hiring choices, the tiny acts of consistency that compound. Guard your minutes and your boundaries. Choose allies who are not performative but structural. And when you find that something social has turned poisonous, remember that institutions are not immune. They simply respond to different language. Know the language of the systems that matter to you and use it prudently. For those of you who feel like the rusty car is the most visible thing you own, I see you. I remember the taste of shame, the smell of old upholstery, the way a single jeer can feel like a thud. That memory is useful. It keeps me anchored to where I started so that my choices are not about spectacle but about use. Money made certain things possible: options, mobility, leverage. But wealth did not make me less human. If anything, it sharpened the responsibility I felt to behave in ways that were not performative. There is also a pragmatic truth I learned along the way. Dignity is not always self-evident in a room full of people. Sometimes you have to make it clear by acting as if you already own it. That can be done with a card in a bag and a few calm sentences, or with confidential conversations that shift budgets and partnerships, or with donations that build ladders. The method is less important than the aim: to create conditions where people are less likely to harm out of boredom or habit. A year after the reunion, the scholarship program had placed 20 students into summer internships, 3 of whom returned to our company full-time. We opened a tiny lab in my hometown where teenagers could learn web development, and we funded a local nonprofit that provides legal aid to people experiencing workplace harassment. The money did not stop cruelty, but it did make avenues of recourse more accessible. For every small victory we funded, there were dozens of unseen moments of resilience that we simply enabled. People like tidy narratives, humiliation, then comeback, then final moral. Real life is messier. There were weeks of doubt after the big donation. There were Sundays I sat on the roof and thought about the people I'd excluded, and wondered if I had been too quick. There were colleagues who worried about the public scrutiny and the pressure it put on their work. I listened. I adjusted. I learned that leadership is not a single speech, but a lifetime of micro-corrections. As for the reunion's later chapters, some people called me coy. Others accused me of using money. And there are always those who think the only acceptable form of triumph is silent endurance. My answer to them is quiet. Wealth helped me change the account I had with the world, but it didn't give me courage. Courage had been purchased in smaller installments. Nights of work, small refusals to play along, those long, lonely decisions to keep building. Money is a tool. Use it well. On the rare nights when I drive past the lot where the rusty car still sits, parked against a less glamorous strip mall because nostalgia sometimes demands fidelity, I feel a quiet tenderness for the young woman who slept on an air mattress with a duffel and a head full of spreadsheets. I feel tenderness because she made choices that did not always feel popular, but those choices allowed me to build options for others. I think of dignity not as something that arrives overnight, but as a daily choice. If there is one concrete thing I hope people take from this, it's that boundaries are practical. They are not moral theatrics. They are a way of preserving the bandwidth you need to do meaningful work. When people laugh at you because your car has rust, you do not have to explain the years behind the rust. You can choose how much you let that moment direct your life. You can choose whether to turn humiliation into fuel for bitterness or into fuel for change. I chose the latter, not because it was clean, but because it was useful. And here's the last practical note, the kind of small, boring advice people rarely want but often need. Keep your legal and governance housekeeping up to date. Not because paperwork is glamorous, but because when social storms appear, institutions respond to documents, not to drama. A solid shareholder agreement, a thoughtful code of conduct, and a board that respects clarity are not trophies. They're defensive infrastructure. They buy you time to respond with dignity. This is my story. I drove into a reunion in a rusty car and was laughed at. I drove back into the same place having built something people could not easily ignore. The art gets compressed in headlines. Rusty car, billionaire. But the truth is a long, daily stitch of choices, some lonely, some generous, that made the rest possible. If this story resonated with you, if you have been underestimated because of appearances or because your life choices didn't align with the small-town script, I want to hear about it. Comment below with Team Madison if you believe dignity is something you can reclaim by building quietly and standing firm. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that boundaries are not weakness, and that generosity can be a form of closure.